All right, folks, I'm going to get started. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the first of the last two classes that we have together. So the semester is basically over, but we still have some stuff to cover, of course, and an exam to take. So definitely not the time to be relaxing. Not necessarily because of this class, but because of all the classes you're taking. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that's due that needs to be gotten done, meaning that you should be taking care of it now rather than later. Everything should be taken care of now. So the best approach for any of you is to just kind of lay out for you a list of everything that you have to get done between now and the end of the semester. Look at the amount of time you have and then just kind of parse it out along that time, and then focus on each individual task every day that you've set for yourself. Don't think about the entirety of everything you have to do, because that's when it becomes overwhelming and it starts to weigh you down and you start to not want to do anything. Just get it all kind of scheduled out for yourself and then focus on exactly what you're doing. Don't worry about everything else. Just focus on the task at hand. You get through it one day at a time, one task at a time. If you start working now, it's not too late for you to do really well this semester and everything that you have to do from this point till the end. And then you can walk away feeling really good about what you accomplish here and have a really nice break, which is what it's all about ultimately, having a good sort of sense of accomplishment, not having any regrets, being able to actually enjoy your free time versus, worrying about having to retake courses and feeling bad about the fact that you could have done better, etc. So this is the time. It's not tomorrow. It's not next week. It is now. So just take it. Take the moment and do the best you can. So as far as this course goes, we're going to cover Chapter 16 today and most, if not all, of Chapter 17 as well. So that will get us through the fourth of the 5 chapters that we're covering that will be on the final. So remember, the final is not cumulative. We're going to only be, you will only, I was going to say we're going to be tested. You will be tested on the material of these 5 chapters, not prior to that. So at the very least, you have that to console you, ideally. But still, there is a good amount of information. And so we'll cover chapter 16 and 17 today. And then the last chapter, which is the open economy macroeconomics, which opens up the theory to international macroeconomics, which is really where it's all about. It's all about the interaction of domestic economies internationally via currencies, via all the markets that they interact in. That's where the action is today. And so there's going to be an introduction of a lot of fairly sophisticated and kind of definitely new concepts in that final chapter. So it's definitely not something to just kind of brush aside. Oh, it's the last stuff I have to learn. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal. There's enough to learn in that chapter where it's going to require a good amount of attention from you to really grasp it. And therefore, I hope that you took my advice and during the break you really got down chapters 14 and 15, the money and banking and the monetary policy chapter, because those are themselves just their own sort of self-contained large challenges as far as you being able to kind of have it all in your mind and being able to understand how it all connects and how it works together. So you want to have that down. You want to get down what we're covering today as soon as possible, and therefore leave yourself to have time to really truly figure out the last chapter, because again, it's going to be a lot of new concepts that are not necessarily intuitive, not necessarily based on things that we've already covered. It would be worth your time to read ahead, finish the amount of material that we're covering in the course now. The sooner the better. Get it out of the way, and then just start setting up study guides for yourself so you can really kill the final. Because like I mentioned last time, the final is not curved, but the final grade is curved. So I'll take your score out of 100 in the final, multiply that by 25, to get the Moodle score that will be added to your grade, and then I will curve the entire class based on your aggregate score, the total score of all the points that you earned in the class. And of course, one of one of your exams, the highest exam, will have a 30% weight versus 25% weight. I'll make that adjustment in the end before I do the curving. But again, if you do really well in the final, it could have a really big impact on your grade. But if you do bad on the final, it will bring your grade down because again, there won't be that inflated sort of extra score from the curving. So keep that in mind. Again, today is when you want to get things done. Tonight, tomorrow, now. Get all this stuff down. You know the chapters we're covering. You know what's going to be on the final. I'll get a practice exam to you within the week. Sooner rather than later. I've already started working on it. I should be done within the next couple of days, maybe even tomorrow. We'll see how things go. But as soon as I have that, I will post it for you. But again, the exam is a practice exam. It is not a study guide. It is not what you will be. It is not the exam you will be tested on. It is a version of what you could be tested on, which is meant to be used as a tool to gauge where you stand and give you an idea of what you should be working on in order to expand your knowledge of everything that we cover in the class. Studying just a practice exam is not the way to approach this course. If it was, this course would be 3 days long. One day to give you the practice exam and then test you on it. The next time to do the second one, and the third to do the final. That's not the course. The course is the book that you are reading that I am covering in class. It is the theory. It is a foundation for not just further learning in a particular program, but a foundation of understanding of some of the really important forces that affect your lives. And so ideally you've had that in mind, and that's been driving you to learn as much as possible from this class, or at the very least, have a set of references for yourself that you can always refer back to as you move forward in life, and sort of become exposed to different things that might be happening in the world that relate to concepts in this course. And you can easily just refer back and what did this mean, what did that mean, and then just kind of figure things out that are affecting your lives and those around you, and can be intimidating and mysterious and scary to those that don't understand it. So a lot of value in this course. So I expect you to be learning what we are covering. But again, in my slides, as you know, I present a lot of information. It's just a lot of it is meant to give you context, to give you more sort of profound understanding of the concepts. But this class is about learning the language of economics. It's about learning the tools of economics. And so it's really about understanding the phenomena that we're studying with economics, being able to talk about that via the language, and being able to analyze it with the tools, with the models. So that's what you should be focusing on. Those of you that are doing well have been listening to me since the beginning, and so you are doing well. All of this whole speech, though, is meant to ideally incite some sort of drive in those that aren't doing so well, or maybe are in the middle, to maybe step it up a bit in this last, in this final stretch before the end, and ideally at least have a strong finish, because at the very least a strong finish will have some lasting impact on your academic record. Any questions about anything before I actually move on to the material? Anything you want me to address? Yeah. 16 and 17, potentially all of 17. Why? What is this? What is this? It is a lot of material, but it's the course. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Format will be the same. 4 open-ended questions and 15 multiple choice. Other questions?
Do you have a favorite chapter?
Actually, the open economy and macroeconomics is my favorite chapter, the final one. So, but really, this whole subject is my favorite subject in economics. So, I've had a. I'll then have to cite you for cheating. But you can have one.
I have a proposition to make.
Okay.
I'm just saying, some teachers do it in their class, some
Oh, no. That is like a recipe for disaster.
Just for one.
I don't know what kind of classes you've been taking. I don't know who's been teaching your classes, but that sounds like a really bad idea.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't do that. Yeah. No, the way the exams are done, it works in economics courses. Maybe a different approach works in different disciplines, like art or something. I don't know. But this is a technical course. You need to demonstrate that you understand this stuff and you have put in the work to get it, because you can't just casually get it. You have to really dig in and dig deep to really get this stuff down. And that's what you need to demonstrate in the exams. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I always recommend that. Yeah, that's that. In fact, I ask you to bring a calculator. There won't be a lot of math, but there always is some math. So yeah, I mean, you should have a calculator. But I do bring calculators in case people don't bring them, even though you should bring them. But yeah, I do have some calculators for those that don't have them. Any other questions you want me to address? All right, let's jump right into it. Yeah, let's do that quick sprint to the end. Cover as much as possible. So, um, Chapter 16 is not money, banking, and Federal Reserve System. I put the wrong thing on there. It's actually inflation, deflation, and hyperinflation, I think it's called. Um, Disinflation. Okay. So we're going to cover the relationship between money and inflation. We're going to cover the moderate inflation and disinflation. So disinflation was a process of bringing down like a high price level. Deflation is just like prices going down. But the process of bringing inflation down is disinflation. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about inflation and unemployment in the long run. So there's like a trade-off in the short run between unemployment and inflation. If you are expanding the economy, if it's an expansionary period, then obviously prices are going to be going up, and unemployment will be going down. During times when unemployment is high, the output is contracting, jobs are scarce, unemployment then leads to low price levels. And so there is this like negative relationship between the two. In the long run, it kind of falls apart. We'll talk about why that is. It has to do with expectations of inflation and how they play a role in actual inflation. We'll briefly talk about deflation and its effects on debt and what that can do to the economy. And then we'll jump into chapter 17, deal with crisis and consequences. So specifically talking about just moments like 2008 and how banking and money is sort of like directly connected to that. And we'll just talk about the issues related to that. There won't be any models in chapter 17, so it'll mostly be like terminology and just kind of like kind of summarizing some of the stuff we've already covered and just forming connections between a lot of the things that we've talked about. So we'll just generally talk about banking. We've talked about the history of banking in the U.S., which was focused on depository institutions, but now we're going to talk about slightly what's called the shadow banking sector, which includes like hedge funds and investment banks and money market funds. So we'll talk about their role in banking and their relationship to crises, which is pretty significant. We'll talk about banking crises and financial panics and the consequences of banking crises as far as like its impact on the economy. So we understand ideally at this point how significant the events of 2008 were, and how they are still reverberating throughout the economy, affecting our lives to this day. That was directly related to banking. And so there is a strong link between the lowest periods that we've had over like the last couple of centuries in the business cycle and banking crisis. So we're going to talk about that link in fine detail today. And then, of course, talk about 2008's crisis and its aftermath briefly, just to kind of tie it all up. But before that, let's jump into a couple of practice short answers just to kind of whet your knowledge of things that you ideally already know, but we have covered in the past, so maybe do a little bit of review. This first one has to do with money. So we defined what money was in chapter 14. So this question sort of asks you to exhibit your understanding of what money is. So part A says, suppose you hold a gift certificate that's good for certain products at participating stores. The question is this gift certificate money? And if so or not, why or why not? So I won't open it up to you because we don't have a lot of time, but let's just go through some of the terminology and some of the stuff we covered already to allow you to really get the insights you need to be able to understand why the answers are what they are. So as we learned in chapter 14, money is any asset that can easily be used to purchase goods and services. An asset is liquid if it can easily be converted into cash. So, you've got what are called near monies. So things that are not exactly able to be converted, able to be used for purchases of goods and services, like money in a savings account or money in a money market account. But those sorts of assets can easily be liquefied, converted into cash, and therefore used as money. Money consists of cash itself, which is liquid by definition, as well as other assets that are highly liquid. So we talked about currency in circulation. Currency in circulation is the actual cash that is in the hands of the public. We talked about checkable bank deposits. So it's basically checking accounts, which are assets to you, the depositors, and liabilities to the banks because they have to pay you back for those. So bank accounts on which people can write checks are the checkable bank deposits. Currency in circulation and checkable bank deposits make up the money supply. And the money supply is the total value of financial assets in the economy that are considered money. The third one is traveler's checks, but they make up a very small portion of the money supply. So we just generally kind of just ignore them and say currency in circulation and checkable bank deposits are the money supply. Money plays a crucial role in generating the gains from trade because it makes indirect exchange possible, right? So in a world without money, the farmers that raise their cows and they want to buy shoes, they have to somehow trade a cow for shoes. It gets kind of weird. So money solves what's called the problem of finding a double coincidence of wants, the situation in which you find two people that are willing to trade the things they're actually looking for, which is not always going to happen when you don't have money. So in a barter system, two parties can trade only when each wants what the other has to offer. So money plays three important roles in a modern economy. It's a medium of exchange. It's an asset that individuals acquire for trading rather than consumption. It's a store of value, a means of holding purchasing power over time, and it's a unit of account, a measure used to set prices and make economic calculations. So those are the three roles that money serves in a modern economy. So getting back to the question, suppose you hold a gift certificate good for certain products at participating stores. Is this gift certificate money? Why or why not? Is this money? No, it is not money, right? You can purchase some goods and services, but you can't purchase all goods and services, right? Well, that's what I meant. Yeah, that's what it was intended by it. Yeah. So the defining characteristic of money is its liquidity, how easily it can be used to purchase goods and services. Although a gift certificate can easily be used to purchase a very defined set of goods and services, the goods or services available at the store issuing the gift certificate, it cannot be used to purchase other goods or services. Yeah. So you can call it, I guess you can kind of consider it a near money, meaning that you could easily make it liquid. You could easily convert it into cash. So it's not actual money, but it's a near money because you. No, yeah. Was there another question? Is that a no or a yes? Okay. Excellent. So a gift certificate, therefore, is not money since it cannot be easily used to purchase all goods and services. Part B, explain why a system of commodity-backed money uses resources more efficiently than a system of commodity money. So understanding this question means understanding what commodity-backed money is versus commodity money. Does anyone know the difference? All right, let's move forward. I'll tell you what it is. Commodity money is a good used as a medium of exchange that has intrinsic value in other uses, like gold and silver. Those are things that you can turn into jewelry, you can turn into whatever, but you can also use as money. So that is commodity money. Commodity backed money is just like a legal document that says, well, you can exchange this for the commodity that is backing its value, which is gold or silver or whatever. So commodity backed money is a medium of exchange with no intrinsic value, whose ultimate value is guaranteed by a promise that it can be converted into valuable goods. And then, of course, today we use what's called fiat money, which is a medium of exchange whose value derives entirely from its official status as a means of payment. The fact that it has value is just basically established by the fact that the government is backing it as having value. Two advantages over commodity-backed money. Fiat money, creating it doesn't use up any real resources beyond the paper that it's printed on. And the supply of money can be adjusted based on the needs of the economy instead of the amount of gold and silver that prospectors happen to find. So that's the benefits of fiat money versus using commodity-backed money. Anyway, so the problem again asks you to explain why a system of commodity-backed money uses resources more efficiently than a system of commodity money. So the answer, commodity-backed money uses resources more efficiently than simple commodity money like gold and silver coins because commodity-backed money ties up fewer valuable resources. Although a bank must keep some of the commodity, generally gold and silver, on hand, it only has to keep enough to satisfy demand redemptions. It can then lend out the remaining gold and silver, which allows society to use those resources for other purposes with no loss in the ability to achieve the gains from trade that money generates. So there you go. Let's move on to another practice short answer, opportunity cost of holding money. So remember, people can use cash or they can invest it and earn some kind of return. And so if you're holding cash, you're not investing it. So that's the opportunity cost of holding money, the interest that you could earn if you didn't hold the money. So which of the following will increase the opportunity cost of holding cash, reduce it, have no effect, explain? Part A. Merchants charge a 1% fee on debt or credit card transactions for purchases of less than $50. So the question is, will that increase the opportunity cost of holding cash, reduce it, or have no effect? It will reduce it, right? Because now, if you have money, then you're going to avoid that extra charge, would eat into like your overall wealth. So a 1% processing fee on debt or credit card transactions for purchases less than $50 reduces the opportunity cost of holding cash because consumers will save money by paying with cash. Part B, to attract more deposits, banks raise the interest paid on 6-month CDs, which are certificates of deposit, which we talked about already, which again are just like time deposits. Like you say you deposit money in a bank and you promise not to withdraw it for 30 days or 60 days or whatever, and you get a higher interest than you would on a normal checking account. So it increases, right? It increases because it is essentially the opportunity cost of money. It is the interest that you could earn, and that interest has gone up. So an increase in the interest paid on 6-month CDs raises the opportunity cost of holding cash because holding cash requires foregoing the higher interest paid. Part C, it's the holiday shopping season and retailers have temporarily slashed prices to unexpectedly low levels. Increase the opportunity cost of holding cash, reduce it, or have no effect? Reduce it, right? It reduces the opportunity cost. This reduces it because it can now be used to fund purchases at very low prices and compensating its owner for any interest foregone by holding the cash. D, the cost of food rises significantly. It will have an effect. The cost of food rises significantly. It's decreased. Because many purchases of food are made in cash, a significant increase in the cost of food reduces the opportunity cost of holding cash because you need more money. You need money to buy food. All right, another practice question having to do with the liquidity preference model, which was the model, which is essentially the money market model that we use to sort of understand the movements of the supply of money, what that does to the interest rate, and then how that ultimately affects aggregate demand or supply and the impact it might have on the economy. So assume there's an increase in the demand for money at every interest rate. Using a diagram, explain what effect this will have on the equilibrium interest rate for a given money supply. So there's an increase in the demand for money at every interest rate. And so the first thing you want to do is you want to set up your liquidity preference model, your money market. So again, the price of money is the opportunity cost of holding it, which is the interest rate, and therefore that will be the price on your y-axis. And of course, the quantity of money, it will be the variable on your x-axis. And of course, we have a downward sloping demand. And we talked about why that is in the last chapter. And then remember, the money supply is basically something that's set by the central bank, and so it is independent of the interest rate, and therefore it is a vertical line, and that represents the money supply. So if there's an increase in the demand for money, what's going to happen to the equilibrium interest rate? Well, that's what's going to happen to the money demand curve. What's going to happen to the equilibrium interest rate? It's going to increase, right? Right. So this is our initial equilibrium interest rate, and again, we're looking at an increase in the demand. So that's going to shift our demand curve to the right, which will increase the equilibrium interest rate. So in the accompanying diagram, the increase in the demand for money is shown as a rightward shift of the money demand curve from MD1 to MD2. This raises the equilibrium interest rate from R1 to R2. All right, so just a couple things to kind of ideally jog your memory a bit in terms of what we covered right after the second exam. But again, ideally you've gone through that material again yourself and have gotten it down mostly by this point. But if you haven't, there's still time to really get this stuff down. You need to get it down if you want to do well in the final. All right, let's jump into chapter 16, inflation, disinflation, and deflation. What we'll learn in this chapter, why efforts to collect an inflation tax by printing money can lead to high rates of inflation and hyperinflation. So when money is printed, essentially the value of money goes down because there's more money in the economy. And so that is what is considered an inflation tax. When the government decides to increase the money supply, they're essentially lowering the value of the existing money, which is considered a tax. We'll talk about the Phillips curve, a relationship between unemployment and inflation, and how it describes the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. We'll talk about why there's no long-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. We'll talk about why expansionary policies are limited due to the effects of expected inflation. We'll talk about why even moderate levels of inflation can be hard to end. And we'll talk about why inflation is a problem for economic policy and leads policymakers to prefer a low but positive inflation rate. So there's a certain amount of inflation that is acceptable that most central banks sort of target. We talked about that last time, the fact that there are target inflation rates for central banks. We'll talk about why the nominal interest rate cannot go below the zero bound and the danger a liquidity trap poses. So a liquidity trap happens when the central bank lowers the interest rate down to zero, and that's what it's called. It's called a liquidity trap. We're actually in one now, and I talked about last time how the central bank is engaging in different strategies to try to still affect the economy. and it's unconventional and it's kind of experimental, but it's the best they can do given that we are in a liquidity trap right now. All right, let's talk about money and inflation. So the classical model of money and prices. So before Keynes, there was like a standard way of viewing how the economy worked. There was no short run in those approaches of analysis. Everything was sort of like instantaneous, so there wasn't like that process of like, well, in the short run, we should be doing these things in order to try to mitigate the effects of our economy, like maybe in a recession or whatever. Whereas before, like that wasn't the consensus, and therefore we didn't have a lot of government policies to try to, affect the economy in order to try to help, the people that are suffering the most as a result of recessions and depressions. So in chapter 15, we learn that in the short run, an increase in the money supply increases real GDP by lowering the interest rate and stimulating investment spending and consumer spending. So again, to increase the money supply, the central bank buys a bunch of treasury bills from commercial banks. They deposit that money that they pay for those bills into the reserve accounts of the banks, and then that starts the money multiplier process that we talked about in chapter 14, and that creates more money. That shifts the money supply curve to the left, right? It increases the money supply, which lowers the equilibrium interest rate. It lowers the opportunity cost of investing, and therefore people are more willing to invest now rather than hold their money in some kind of asset that will give them some basic return. Like they are willing to go out and spend on capital and produce. And so that starts to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And then also that leads to then consumers also increasing their consumption via the multiplier process, and therefore further shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. So remember, we have aggregate demand, downward sloping, the short run aggregate supply curve, upward sloping. They intersect at some point that establishes an equilibrium price level and output level for the economy. When the economy is at the long run level of output, the short run level of output is at potential output, where the economy is always kind of trying to get, and it's not in any kind of inflationary or recessionary gap. An increase in the money supply, again, reduces the interest rate and increases aggregate demand, which shifts aggregate demand to the right, and that temporarily raises the price level. But as we know, the reason why there is this sort of short-run behavior that does lead to an increase in output above potential is because wages are sticky, right? Like wages don't adjust to price levels, to the overall price level quickly enough, but eventually they do. So the eventual rise in nominal wages leads to a fall in the short-run aggregate supply. So the short-run aggregate supply eventually shifts to the left, and aggregate output then falls back to its potential output. But the final effect is that the price level has gone up. So the money supply has gone up, and that has caused the price level to go up. So this leaves the real quantity of money, the money divided by the price level, the actual goods and services that can be bought with money, at its original level. So that's what is represented by us getting back to this point. And there's no longer an effect on aggregate demand or real GDP. When analyzing large changes in the aggregate price level, macroeconomists often find it useful to ignore the distinction between the short run and the long run, and basically just talk about this effect that money increases have on the overall price level, not think about the whole process of adjustment. This reflects, again, the classical model of money. So in a simplified model, the effect of a change in the money supply on the aggregate price level takes place instantaneously rather than over a long period of time. This is a reasonable assumption to make in the case of high inflation. So when we have high inflation, meaning prices are going up a lot all the time, really fast, under those circumstances, then we can avoid that sort of process of, like, wages being sticky and then wages eventually adjusting, because in a situation where there is hyperinflation, wages are actually also adjusting very quickly as well. So a simplified model in which the real quantity of money, which is the amount of money divided by the price level, is always at its long-run equilibrium level, is known as the classical model of the price level. Again, this is the model that was used before Keynes came along. So the classical money of the price level, according to this model, the real quantity of money is always at its long-run equilibrium level. So again, it was commonly used by classical economists who wrote before the work of John Maynard Keynes, before the invention of macroeconomics, but it is a model that can be used to study situations where there's hyperinflation. So in reality, this is a poor assumption during periods of low inflation, since it may take a while for workers and firms to react to a monetary expansion by raising wages and prices. In the face of high inflation, though, economists have observed that the short-run stickiness of nominal wages and prices tends to vanish. Workers and businesses sensitized to inflation are quick to raise their wages and prices in response to changes in the money supply. This implies that under high inflation, there is quicker adjustment of wages and prices of intermediate goods than occurs in the case of low inflation. So in countries with persistently high inflation, changes in the money supply are quickly translated into changes in the inflation rate. So that whole process that I went through with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, leading to just a change in the price level as a result of an increase in the money supply, happens instantaneously under those conditions where you have high inflation. So here we've got money supply growth and inflation in Zimbabwe from 2013 to 2008. This is the annual percent change in in either the price level or the money supply. So we see that the money supply over this period is sort of gradually increasing, but then definitely start to increase quite a bit. And then we see that the consumer price index, which again tracks the overall level of prices in the economy, it's one of the price indexes that we covered in the second part of the course. I think the first part of the course. Is also moving in pretty much the same direction. So, and following the same pattern. Just a quick note on this graph. To fit these very large percent change increases onto the figure, it's drawn using a log scale. So it's using a logarithmic scale on the vertical axis that allows us to draw equal size percent changes as the same size. So we go from like 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 to 1,000,000%. And the reason we can do that is because we're using logs. But that's something that you get to know more as you take more advanced courses. Don't worry too much about that. I just need to mention it just for people that are like, why? This is weird. This is a weird scale. But anyway, the point here is that money supply and the consumer price index are basically moving in tandem. And that is a result of the fact that prices are changing almost instantaneous during times of hyperinflation, when the government is printing a lot of money. We're going to talk about why that happens in a second. But let's talk about the inflation tax, the fact that when money is printed and there's more money in the economy, that the value of money goes down, the real value of money goes down. And again, when we're talking about real, we're talking about the value of something in terms of what it can be exchanged for actual goods and services. So modern economies, as I mentioned earlier, use fiat money, right? It's not backed by anything but just the power of the government. Central banks are tasked with printing the bills and are partly shielded from political influence, as we talked about. We talked about how the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States has this board of governors that's made up of seven members, and they're chosen by the president, but they serve 14-year terms, except for the head, which serves 4-year terms, but that's meant to shield them from like short-term political oscillations within, the political economy that might be occurring at the time, and how also the Federal Open Market Committee is the one that makes decisions about monetary policy, and that's made up of the seven members of the Board of Governors plus 5 members of the 12-member Federal Reserve banks. So 5 of those presidents also serve on the board. The New York president is always on there because the New York president is governs the Federal Reserve Bank that actually carries out the federal open market operations, which again involves either buying or selling bonds to either increase or contract the money supply. But anyway, the entire nature of that whole Federal Reserve System is meant to shield monetary policy from political fluctuations. And when we say central banks are tasked with printing the bills, like we know that means they're just like electronically crediting reserve accounts for banks. Sometimes they print the bills when they're asked to, when the banks are like, oh, we want to get paid in actual currency, but generally it is a digital transaction that occurs. If politicians decide to seize control of monetary policy, though, remember there's many central banks throughout the world. Some countries are unstable with respect to like their government. They don't have the kind of checks and balances we have. Things can fall apart. But also in this country, sometimes there is some political cracks in our monetary policy framework. So if politicians decide to seize control of monetary policy, they can use political will to drive monetary policy. Nothing prevents the government from printing money to pay its bills, so therefore it can be influenced to do that. Governments, including the U.S., do it all the time. So in the U.S., we do that as well. It's not a problem in this country, but sometimes it's something that we do use in order to deal with the shortfall of our budget deficit. So in the case of the U.S., the Treasury and the Federal Reserve work in concert. So the Treasury issues debt to finance the government's purchases of goods and services. So the Treasury is the one that actually issues those bonds, which are either short-term, like 1 year, which are called bills, or they're like around 10 years, which are called notes, or they're like long-term, around 30 years, which are called actual bonds. So those are the debt instruments that the Treasury sells to the public in order to raise some funds. And then the Fed monetizes that debt, meaning they buy the debt from the commercial banks and then they credit those banks with money, which then starts a money multiplier process, which then creates more money in the economy. So the Fed monetizes the debt by creating money and buying the debt back from the public through the open market purchase of Treasury bills, as we mentioned. So the U.S. government then winds up paying interest on the debt owned by the Federal Reserve. So it's kind of a weird thing to think about. The government's kind of paying the interest to itself. The Fed, by law, hands the interest payments it receives on government debt back to the Treasury, and it only keeps enough to fund its own operations. So it's not like this weird thing where like the Fed is actually profiting from the government. It is part of the government, but as I mentioned last time, it's partly private as well. So it's partly owned by the banking system. So again, it's sort of this weird situation, but it is not profiting from the federal government. It does, like I said, give back the interest that the government pays it to the Treasury, aside from what it needs to run, the 12 banks that it runs and pay, all the employees, etc. So in effect, the Federal Reserve's actions does enable the government to pay off some outstanding government debt by printing money. It's a more complicated system, obviously, than you would think, but it is sort of a roundabout way of doing things. An alternative way to look at this is to say that the right to print money is itself a source of revenue. So we have this term called seigniorage. And it just defines the revenue generated by a government's right to print money. So seigniorage is an archaic term that goes back to the Middle Ages, which refers to the right to stamp gold and silver into coins and charge a fee for doing so, that the medieval lords, which in France were called seigneurs, reserved for themselves. So then that's where that term comes from, that seigniorage term, that again means the revenue generated by a government's right to print money. So seigniorage normally accounts for only a small fraction, in this case 1% of the U.S. government's budget, so it's not too bad. The government doesn't take advantage of their right to do this. They use it when they need to, but it's not like a dependency thing, because if it was, it would spiral out of control, as we'll highlight in a second. So concerns about seigniorage don't have any influence on the Federal Reserve's decisions about how much money to print. The Fed is worried about inflation, unemployment, not revenue. So that the Fed is just focused on what it needs to be focused on with respect to what it has to do, which is, again, to enact monetary policy. So according to the usual scenario, a government finds itself running a large budget deficit and lacks either the competence or the political will to eliminate the deficit by raising taxes or cutting spending. The government can't borrow to cover the gap because potential lenders won't extend loans because they know that the government's in trouble. So governments then end up printing money to cover their budget deficits. Printing money to cover a budget deficit leads to inflation, and therefore it leads to what's called the inflation tax, the reduction in the value of money held by the public caused by inflation. So because the government is depending on their seigniorage, they wind up imposing an inflation tax on the people. So let's talk about the logic of hyperinflation. How does a country get into the situation that we saw with Zimbabwe? So when inflation is high, people will try to avoid holding money and will instead substitute real goods as well as interest-bearing assets for money. So they're going to try to get rid of the money because it's not worth anything. During the peak of the German hyperinflation, post-World War I, Germany had the worst situation as far as their economy goes, which led to the rise of the Nazis and World War II, etc. But during that time, essentially their money was worth nothing. So people would burn the paper money, which was less valuable than wood. People don't just reduce their nominal money holdings, though. They reduce their real money holdings. They cut the amount of money they hold so much that it actually has less purchasing power than the amount of money they would hold if inflation were low. They do this by using the money to buy goods that last over time or assets that hold their value like gold. So it's sort of the opposite trajectory of like us developing our fiat money system from commodity money to commodity-backed money to fiat money. It's sort of the opposite course when the money starts to become worthless because of hyperinflation, because of a high inflation tax. So high inflation arises when the government must print a large quantity of money to cover their large budget deficits. So if we let the change in the money supply be represented by this triangle, change M, and it represents the monthly change in the money supply, and it also is what we call seigniorage. So it is like the extra revenue that the government gets from their right to print money. So it's more useful to look at real seigniorage, the revenue generated by printing money divided by the price level. So if we look at real seigniorage, which is, again, the change in the money supply with the seigniorage divided by the price level, which gives us real seigniorage. And if we multiply that by 1, so that's a trick that you can do in anything that involves math, is like multiply by 1 or add 0, which is add a term then subtract it. So in this case, we're multiplying by 1, so we're multiplying it by the money supply over the money supply. We can move this around, and therefore we can represent real seigniorage as this term here, the change in the money supply seigniorage over the money supply, times the real money supply, which is money over P. So therefore, real seigniorage is equal to the rate of growth of the money supply, which is the change in M over M, times the real money supply. This is all meant to give you understanding about how hyperinflation works. So that's what we're building up to here. So in the face of high inflation, the public reduces the real amount of money it holds. As I mentioned, they jump ship with respect to currency and start to buy things like gold, etc. So therefore, as far as real seigniorage goes, which is like the actual value of the amount that the government is, amount of money the government is printing in order to pay its bills, and as far as the value of that, so you have the real money supply, people jumping ship on it, that's going to lower the real value of the seigniorage. So it's going to lower what the government can do with the money that it prints. So if the government needs to print more money, then they will have to accelerate the rate of growth of the money supply. So people start jumping ship on the money supply when there's not a lot of inflation, and the only thing the government can do is to print more money in order to, be able to pay its debts. So this leads to even higher inflation. So you've got, again, People jump and ship on the currency, real money supply going down, rate of growth of the money supply going up. As the process becomes self-reinforcing, it can easily spiral out of control, and that's what leads to hyperinflation. So again, here we have Zimbabwe's inflation. They had the same situation happen from 2000 to 2008. If we think about their CPI, 2000 being the base year, by 2008, their price level had gone up, in this case by I think 100 trillion%. So over 8 years, consumer prices rose by 80 trillion%. So what the reason for this was, Robert Mugabe rose to power at one point when Zimbabwe became independent, and he seized the farms that were owned by descendants of white colonists and then gave the farms to his supporters. Production fell as a result, and the tax base then fell, right? There was no tax revenue base because, again, production contracted. And so Zimbabwe couldn't borrow money in world markets because it was unstable. And that left it only one option, and that was to print money. And therefore, they wound up being in this state of hyperinflation. So that's just one example of how this could happen. It happens in a lot of developing countries, unfortunately. And it could potentially happen here, but it won't happen here. All right, so let's talk about moderate inflation and disinflation. So this will get us to the relationship between inflation and unemployment. So was there a question? Okay. So the governments of wealthy, politically stable countries like the US and Britain don't find themselves forced to print money to pay their bills, fortunately. Over the past 40 years, both countries, along with a number of other nations, have experienced uncomfortable episodes of inflation, though. So we have had inflation in the 70s. We had pretty bad inflation. This happens due to interaction between the short-run balancing act of trying to smooth out the business cycle and the interests of politicians. So you might have elections which might drive expansionary measures during times of low inflation. So like right now, where Donald Trump is promising to, rebuild our infrastructure, which essentially would increase government spending, which would shift aggregate demand to the right, which would raise prices. The opposite won't happen during periods of high inflation, though. Like, governments or elected officials, they will not say, oh, well, we're going to cut spending in order to lower inflation, because it's not something that's popular. It's going to lead to us contracting the economy, which means jobs will be lost, etc. So you have this weird situation where politics drives expansion, but then it doesn't drive contraction. So this political asymmetry explains how countries with no need to impose an inflation tax sometimes end up with serious inflation problems. All right, let's talk about the relationship between the output gap and the unemployment rate. So potential output typically grows steadily over time, reflecting long-term growth. We talked about long-term growth and the things that affect that. We talked about how there are three major things that do affect long-term growth in any economy, and that is an increase in human capital. Human capital being the skills and knowledge that people generate over time, and physical capital, the man-made things that are used to produce, as well as increases in technology, improvements in technology. These are the three things that will increase the potential output of the economy, which will cause the economy to grow over time. So recall the percent difference between the actual level of real GDP and potential output is called the output gap. Also recall that the unemployment rate is composed of cyclical unemployment and natural unemployment, right? There's a natural amount of unemployment that occurs in any economy, having to do with there being unemployment in certain sectors, which is structural unemployment, and unemployment because people are moving from jobs, frictional unemployment. So those two types of unemployment make up the natural unemployment rate. And then whenever that is being affected by overall ups and downs in the economy, you have cyclical unemployment rate that is sort of going around the natural unemployment rate. So remember, the natural unemployment rate is a portion of the unemployment rate that's unaffected by the business cycle. The relationship between the unemployment rate and the output gap is defined by two rules. When actual aggregate output is equal to potential output, the actual unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. And when the output gap is positive and you have an inflationary gap, the unemployment rate is going to be below the natural rate. There's just too much employment in the economy. You're actually getting rid of some employment that is natural to the economy, and that is causing prices to go up. And when the output gap is negative, meaning we have a recessionary gap, again, that means that we're producing less than potential output. So there is unemployment. Prices have gone down. During those times, the unemployment rate is above the natural rate, right? The unemployment rate is above. So these fluctuations, Gesundheit, are the cyclical unemployment that is moving around the natural unemployment rate, which, again, corresponds to the level of potential output. So when the economy is at its long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, then the unemployment rate is at its natural state. All right, so this top image shows the actual and natural rates of unemployment as estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. So here we have the actual unemployment rate. Here's our natural rate of unemployment from 1949 to 2014. Natural rate of unemployment, obviously pretty steady, but the actual unemployment is moving quite a bit around it. The bottom image shows cyclical unemployment and the Congressional Budget Office's estimate of the natural rate of unemployment plus the Congressional Budget Office estimate of the output gap measured on the right. So cyclical unemployment is the orange line. Its scale is on the left. And the output gap is it has an inverted scale on the right in order to show how it is moving with the cyclical unemployment. So as unemployment is high, the output gap is going to be big in the negative direction, right? You're going to have a recessionary gap, so the output gap will be negative. So we can see that there's a pretty close relationship between cyclical unemployment and the output gap. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. So to make the relationship clear, the output gap series is inverted, shown upside down, as I mentioned already. All right, so there's this law that kind of talks about how the output gap and the unemployment rate kind of move together. It's not one-to-one. The movements are not one-to-one, but they're close. So cyclical unemployment seems to move slightly less than the output gap. The output gap reached negative 8% in 1982, but cyclical unemployment only reached about 4%. So there's this guy, Arthur Okun, who was John F. Kennedy's chief economic advisor, discovered that there was this relationship between the output gap and the cyclical unemployment, which we now call Okun's law. Okun's law says that there's a predictable negative relationship between the output gap and the unemployment rate. Modern estimates of Okun's law find that the rise in the output gap of 1% reduces the unemployment rate by about half a percentage point. So it's not one-to-one, it's about 1 to 1/2. So if the natural rate of unemployment, let's say, is 5.2%, and the economy is producing only 98% of potential output, there is therefore a negative output gap of 2%. So we're in a recessionary gap. Okun's law predicts an unemployment rate of, so you're going to have the original unemployment rate of 5.2% minus, so you got to multiply that output gap of negative 2% by 1/2 in order to translate the output gap into the unemployment rate. So if you do that, you wind up with a prediction of the unemployment rate to be 6.2% based on Okun's law. It's a pretty consistent law that helps us to, again, clearly sort of track this relationship between the output gap and the unemployment rate. So all of this is kind of meant to kind of like firmly establish the connections between everything we've been talking about, like the price level, the unemployment rate, the output gap, how it all kind of just like is one thing. All right, now let's talk about what's called the short-run Phillips curve. The short-run Phillips curve is the negative short-run relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. The origins of this concept lie in the famous 1958 paper by the New Zealand-born economist A.W.H. Phillips, who studied historical data for Britain. So this is some of the data that he studied. Here's the inflation rate. Here's the unemployment rate, inflation rate on the y-axis, unemployment rate on the x-axis. So he plotted for every year what the unemployment rate and the inflation rate was. So this is part of what we do as economists, is like we plot data and then we kind of try to find like some sort of like linear or some kind of like mathematical relationship between the two variables. We can kind of identify a negative relationship here, meaning that for higher levels of inflation, there will be lower levels of unemployment, and for lower levels of inflation, there will be higher levels of unemployment. So there's kind of a negative relationship there. It's not exact. You're going to have outliers, ones that aren't data points, what we term datums that are not necessarily in line with it. But if you were to do a statistical regression on this, which is something you'll learn about in statistics, you would probably get a line that's like has like a negative slope that represents the relationship between the two variables. So we can kind of estimate this relationship between inflation and unemployment to look like that line that I talked about. So when the unemployment rate is low, inflation is high, and when the unemployment rate is high, inflation is low. And so therefore you have like this line that represents that relationship, which is called the short-run Phillips curve. So here's a short-run Phillips curve. When the inflation rate is 0%, the unemployment rate is at 6%. So let's look at our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Here's our downward sloping aggregate demand. Here's our upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, intersecting at this equilibrium, where the price level in this case is equal to 100. And the economy is at its long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, so it's at potential output, which in this case is $10 trillion. Let's say that the central bank has decided to engage in expansionary monetary policy. That means they're going to buy a bunch of bonds from commercial banks. They're going to credit those banks with money in their reserve account. That will cause the money multiplier process to increase the money supply, which will then shift the money supply curve to the right, which will lower the interest rate. By lowering the interest rate, that's going to lower the opportunity cost of investing, and that means that aggregate demand will shift to the right. So let's say that happened, aggregate demand shifted to the right, that raised the price level and also lowered the amount of unemployment. So as far as what happened on the Phillips curve, we just moved along it. We were initially at this point where there was zero inflation and 6% unemployment, which in this case represents the natural rate of unemployment. That's the unemployment rate that corresponds to potential output. But when the expansionary policy was enacted and aggregate demand shifted to the right in the economy, that caused the price level to go up, but it also caused unemployment to go down. So unemployment goes down to 4%, and inflation goes up to 2%, and we move along the short-run Phillips curve. During the 1950s and 60s, this simple approach seemed for a while to be adequate. So this negative relationship between unemployment and the inflation rate was basically became like a staple of most economic analysis. It seemed to hold. It seemed to be like the go-to relationship. Even at the time, though, some economists argued that a more accurate short-run Phillips curve would include other factors. These are captured as shocks that shift the short-run Phillips curve. So in general, a negative supply shock will shift the short-run Phillips curve up, and a positive supply shock will shift the short-run Phillips curve down. So a negative supply shock, which again means that the short-run aggregate supply curve is shifting to the left, which means that we are increasing unemployment and also increasing the price level. And because that is a positive relationship between the two, and here we have a negative relationship between the two, a supply shock will not translate well into movements along the short-run Phillips curve, and therefore they translate into shifts of the curve. So if you have a negative supply shock, let's say the price of oil went up, so all producers have to supply left, so short-run aggregate supply shifts to the left. That's going to raise your inflation rate at any given unemployment rate, and therefore the short-run Phillips curve will shift up when there's a negative supply shock, and it will shift down when there's a positive supply shock. Supply shocks are not the only factors that can change the the rate of inflation, though. In the early 1960s, Americans had little experience with inflation because inflation rates had been low for decades. By the late 1960s, after inflation had been steadily increasing for a number of years, Americans had to come to expect future inflation. So before that time period, there wasn't inflation, so people didn't expect it. But after that, people did expect it because it started to happen. In 1968, two economists, Milton Friedman of the University of Chicago and Edmund Phelps of Columbia University, independently set forth a crucial hypothesis that expectations about future inflation directly affect the present inflation rate. So, as I said, before the 1960s, people didn't expect inflation to change, and therefore it wasn't an issue. But once it did become an issue, it actually started to affect the inflation rate, and I'll talk about how in a second. So today, most economists accept that the expected inflation rate, the rate of inflation that employers and workers expect in the near future, is the most important factor rather than the unemployment rate that is affecting inflation. So let's talk about inflation expectations and how they factor into the short-run Phillips curve. So if a worker and employer are about to sign a contract setting a worker's wages over the next year, let's say, they have to consider what's going to happen to inflation. What's going to happen to prices over the next year? And obviously that's going to have an impact on the wage that's being set. The wage rate they agreed to will be higher if everyone expects higher inflation, including rising wages, than if everyone expects prices to be stable. So that is how expectations about inflation actually translate into inflation. When people expect prices to go up, that is going to translate into higher wages as far as like employment contracts, which will then actually raise prices, because if wages go up, then the cost of producing goes up, which means the prices that firms charge will be higher as well. So the employer will be more willing to agree to a wage increase now if hiring workers later will be even more expensive. So if there's an expectation about inflation increasing, then there's a possibility that in the future to hire another person, you will have to pay even more than you might settle on now for this person that wants you to take into consideration the fact that inflation is going to happen. Also, rising prices will make paying a higher wage rate more affordable for the employer because the employer's output will sell for more as well. So for these reasons, an increase in expected inflation shifts the short-run Phillips curve upward as well. So again, a negative supply shock will shift the short-run Phillips curve up, and a positive one will shift it down. And expectations in inflation will also shift the short-run Phillips curve. So let's say we have this short-run Phillips curve, and the economy is at the point where there's zero inflation, and we're at 6% unemployment rate, which is the natural rate of unemployment. So for whatever reason, we move along the short-run Phillips curve to this point where there's 4% unemployment and 2% inflation, such as what I showed earlier with aggregate demand shifting to the right, raising prices. Let's say that is what caused this. So because of that, actually, let's not talk about that whole process yet. Let's just understand the fact that at any given point, because employers and employees expect inflation to increase, let's say because of this movement here, they expect inflation to be going up, then they will actually cause inflation to go up. So therefore, at any given unemployment rate, inflation will be higher. If they expect inflation to go up by 2%, then effectively that will cause inflation to go up by 2%, which will then shift the short-run Phillips curve. So at 4% unemployment, we'll now have 4% inflation. At 6% unemployment, we'll now have 2% inflation. So again, the short-run Phillips curve shifts up the amount of the increase in expected inflation. Macroeconomists believe that the relationship between changes in expected inflation and changes in actual inflation is 1-to-1. So like I said, if they expect inflation to go up by 2%, it will go up by 2%. In general, people base their expectations about inflation on experience, what's happened in the past, which again is reflected on the experience that we had in the 60s, where we didn't expect there to be inflation because there wasn't any inflation, and therefore there wasn't any inflation. Obviously, other things can cause inflation, but expectations have a huge impact on inflation, which is what makes economics another reason why economics is a challenging discipline, because we have to take into consideration expectations, what people think will happen rather than what's actually happening. So this was not a concern. So again, in general, people based their expectations about inflation on experience. This was not a concern and therefore not incorporated into the Phillips curve inception due to low inflation before 1960. It was only after 1965 that persistent inflation became a fact of life. But of course, after 1965, we did start to have like inflation. And so the relationship, this negative relationship between inflation and the unemployment rate kind of fell apart. So here we've got, this is us from 1961 through 1990. And so there isn't a clear negative relationship here with respect to inflation and unemployment. So through much of the 70s and early 80s, the economy suffered from what's called stagflation, which is stagnation and inflation. So in the late 1990s, by contrast, the economy was experiencing a blissful combination of low unemployment and low inflation. One reason for this can be attributed to a series of negative supply shocks that the U.S. economy suffered during the 1970s. This is something we talked about a few chapters back, where there were negative supply shocks because the price of oil went up dramatically because OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, was cutting off oil supplies because there was this whole thing going on with Israel and a lot of wars and a lot of turbulence. And then also the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s. These things all affected the supply of oil, which caused supply shocks, which then causes to increase unemployment and inflation, stagflation. So the negative oil price shocks and a slowdown in labor productivity shifted the short-run Phillips curve upward. In the 1990s, supply shocks were positive. Opposite effects. So you had opposite effects with oil prices decreasing and labor productivity increasing, shifting the short-run Phillips curve upward. So inflation expectations reinforced the shifts, which then caused all this sort of weird movement of the relationship between inflation and unemployment. All right, we'll talk about inflation and unemployment in the long run when we get back. Let's come back at 8:30. At 8:30, let's come back. Enjoy your break.